Hello, folks, and welcome to the second installment of the Napoleonic Wars channel live. I'm your host, Dr. Zack White, host of the Napoleonic Wars podcast, the OG, if you will, the mothership that has spawned this YouTube channel. And tonight we're going to talk about something that is very timely, because on the 22nd of July, 1812, a battle was fought that sent perhaps not a shockwave, but certainly a ripple through Europe. It's known as the Battle of Salamanca. Fought a few miles to the south near the town of Los Arapiles, it saw a French army under Marshal Marmont utterly and comprehensively shattered by a combined English, Spanish, and Portuguese force under the command of Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, at that point Earl Wellington. Tonight, we're going to retell the story, but we're going to do it a little bit different. To mark the anniversary of that battle, fought, 211 years ago today. In fact, going on right at this moment, there was fighting at this time. In fact, the latter stages of the battle were being fought at this moment in Spain, 211 years ago, right now. And what I want to do is not just tell that story, not just to take you through what happened, why Salamanca matters, why we should remember it, but to dive deeper, to actually show you the ground. So rather than just the standard talk with a few photos, I'm going to use some footage that I recently shot out in Spain, footage that is going to form the kernel of the wider development of this channel in the form of a series of deep dive and surface level documentaries about some of the big battles of this period. It's a very exciting new development for the Napoleonic Wars channel, but I want to give you a bit of a spoiler, a bit of a reason to enjoy some of the footage that's been shot, because ultimately that's why I do this, for your enjoyment. If you'd like to support the show, obviously these things cost substantial amounts of money to make happen. You've got some ticker tape along the bottom that outlines how you can do so. So if you're interested in providing a one-off tip, that's very generous of you. Thank you very much. Don't feel obligated, but if you can spare a little bit of change, it would certainly help. A lot of money just got invested in sort of new cameras and drones and other expensive fun bits of kit. The details are on the bottom of your screen. Alternatively, if you want to get exclusive content, if you want to immerse yourself in, let's be honest, a Napoleonic Wars nerd zone, there are a whole raft of exclusive perks that you can get via Patreon. Details on the bottom of your screen, patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod, all one word. And you can get things like exclusive episodes, your name in shout outs at the end of the podcast episodes, meetups, socials. There's even a bespoke course that you can join up on and take part in. So if that's of interest, have a look at the links. Any support is obviously very welcome. But now let us get on with the show. I'm going to start with a little bit of context. So I'm not going to start at Salamanca itself. Instead, I'm going to start with this. Just a little bit of background in terms of how we get to Salamanca, because to just drop you in the middle of a war would be a little bit disorientating if you don't know much about the period. So Salamanca is a pivotal battle that happens more than halfway through the Peninsular War. And the Peninsular War is part of a wider war known as the Napoleonic Wars. If you're not familiar with the fact that this show covers the Napoleonic Wars, then you may need to just reassess your choices of entertainment for this evening. I'm not about to give you a potted history of the Napoleonic Wars. That's going to be the subject of many live streams to come. What I am going to do, though, is just take you through the origins of the Peninsular War and rewind you all the way back to the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. Napoleon, at the zenith of his power, he meets with Tsar Alexander, and they basically agree that they have a mutual enemy in the form of Britain. Napoleon decides that the solution is to starve Britain of trade. So he creates the continental system. Nothing wrong with that. The Brits are pretty dastardly at trying to tell people who they can and can't trade with at the best of times. So, this is just tit for tat, frankly. But it goes disastrously wrong because Napoleon is trying to dictate the economic policy of the entire continent. And Portugal initially turns around and says, no, we're an independent nation. We have our own economic policy and our own domestic policy, we don't fancy this idea, actually, of doing what you tell us, because we have freedom. And Napoleon effectively turns around and says, you can either do what I want, or I can invade you. Choice is yours. The Portuguese then do what Napoleon wants, and he invades anyway. That's 1807. In 1808, though, he makes one of the big slip-ups, the big misjudgments, so rare misjudgment for Napoleon. There are times when he reads international diplomacy well, and there are times when he really doesn't. Spain is one of those ones where he gets it catastrophically wrong. When squabbling breaks out between the King, Carlos IV, and his son, the future Ferdinand VII, Napoleon says, look, why don't you come to France? We'll sit down around a table and we'll discuss this in a civilized way. It's no good for the country for you guys to be falling out like this. They go to France, and he promptly arrests them, removes them from the throne of Spain, and places his own brother, Joseph, on the throne of Spain. And unsurprisingly, the Spanish aren't too keen on this. This leads to the Dos de Mayo uprising, such a detailed event that we need a live stream in its own right. On that, we will get there another day. It leads to, there's an uprising in the streets, and fundamentally it gets quashed with brutal force. That leads to reprisal executions the following day by the French. That's depicted on the right here in El Tres de Mayo, part of a series of paintings by Francisco Goya. Google them. They are stunning and incredibly visceral. Also bear in mind that there is a very, very strong element of propaganda. But that's how the Peninsular War kicks off. Early on, they send out a certain guy called Arthur Wellesley, the guy who's going to go on to become the Duke of Wellington, and in a series of battles fights his way across Portugal and central Spain, trying to gain the upper hand over the occupying French forces, with a limited degree of success because of an imbalance in power. By 1812, the French have 250,000 men in Spain trying to keep the region under control. Wellington, as he is by 1812, is in command of something in the region of 70,000 total, split across two regions. So there's a force up in sort of Ciudad Rodrigo region, and there's another one down in the Badajoz region. So let's fast forward to 1812 then, where the Peninsular War has descended into a bit of a stalemate. You've got Wellington up, as I say, around Ciudad Rodrigo. You've got his opposite number, if you like, Auguste Marmont. Now, Marmont gets a bit of flack. Some of it justified, some of it perhaps less so. What I dislike about the stuff that gets bandied around on Marmont is that everybody makes out that the guy's an imbecile. He's really not. I'll give you how much of an indication he's not an imbecile. He's Napoleon's protege. And Napoleon is very good at reading people's characters and working out how that can suit his ends. So Marmont gets his marshal's baton quite late, 1809, after the Bagram campaign. And it's described as sort of friendship's choice. Marmont, I think, was actually as surprised as anybody else that he got the marshal's baton on that occasion, but that's by the by. He's then sent to Spain to take over from Massena, and he's given command of a force called the Army of Portugal, a force somewhere in the region of about 50,000 men. Now, Wellesley has a roughly similar size force. I mean, your estimates vary depending on which books you read, but somewhere between 48 and 52. I think sort of probably 51, 52 is more accurate. And that's based around Ciudad Rodrigo, which you can see with the top red arrow. To the south, there's a sort of covering force, Badajoz, which is under command of Rowland Hill, which is basically there to sort of watch the forces under Soult, who are occupying Andalusia, just in case Soult decides that the time has come that he needs to march north and try and support Marmont. The trouble is, there's a lot of friction between these different commanders in France. To the north, you've got an army of 48,000 men under General Cavalry. That's basically occupied by a series of amphibious operations under the command of a guy who was a total head case called Sir Hugh Popham. He was a commodore, I believe, at this point, and he takes this squadron and sails up and down the north coast of Spain, making a series of landings, basically wreaking havoc, arming the local Spanish guerrillas, and using that to just antagonize and keep the guy occupied, keep him busy. And it works quite well because poor Caffarelli's men basically spend their summer marching up and down the north coast, trying to march faster than a ship can sail. Because as soon as they get anywhere near, Popham packs everything up, jumps on the ship, and sails somewhere else and creates havoc somewhere else. So that's a hugely effective diversionary operation. Out around Valencia, you've got another force under Suchet, about 20. I don't know how many men. Actually, off the top of my head, apologies, I've just glanced at my notes and I don't have that figure to hand. Suchet's the one who sort of gets the Peninsula War right on the French side. He manages to go on sort of a slightly better hearts and minds push in order to try and get the region under control, and is much more effective in the process. But there's a landing around Valencia, the whole campaign in the east of Spain over the summer of 1812 that keeps Suchet occupied. So Wellington's relatively happy that Marmont's on his own, and he goes on the offensive. And it's a campaign that lasts quite a while, in fact. There will be another live stream on the build-up, because there's a whole kind of sequence of events around a series of sieges, well, a siege of 3 forts that Marmont leaves in the town of Salamanca. Then there's a point at which Wellington effectively stands and offers Marmont battle and says, look, he does the 19th century equivalent of going, come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. Except that by this point, the French have learned. A series of battles have been fought at Vimero, at Busaco, at Talavera, at Fuente d'Onoro, where they have attacked Wellington on ground that he has chosen, and he has beaten them like a drum. By this point, they are learning that you don't attack Wellington on ground of his choosing. If you're going to attack him, make sure you're picking a point where he is on the back foot, where you have the advantage. That is the moment to go after Wellington, not the other way around. So that's where we're at in 1812, and that's what leads us to the Salamanca campaign. This is the region over which the campaign is fought. So you can see Salamanca in the bottom left of your picture. San Cristobal, just above it, is that place where Wellington does that thing of standing and offering battle, and Marmont goes, nah, I'm smarter than this. I'm not going to take that. And then you have a series of maneuvers further to the north around Zamora, Toro, Poyos, and Cañathal. And what Marmont is effectively able to do is catch Wellington on the hop, force him into a kind of a series of mirrored, almost like flank marches. So you have a period of time where they're marching from the River Douro at the top of your picture, all the way down effectively towards Salamanca, and they're marching incredibly close to each other, as little as a mile distance, almost within cannon shot. And it's a question of who blinks first, who's going to hold their nerve. One slip up at any moment in that whole kind of week-long march could have been fatal for either side. But by the 22nd of July, Marmont has started to gain the upper hand. Early in the day, you have a continuation of this march around the side of Salamanca, which you can now see is in the top left of your picture. And everything ends up swinging literally on these 2 little formations in the center of the 2 blobs in the center of your picture, the Lesser Arapal and the Greater Arapal. Now, Wellington occupies the Lesser, but misjudges the situation. He doesn't recognize the significance of the Greater Arapal until about 8:30 in the morning, and then sends a force to hurriedly capture it, except that the French have beaten him to it. The Greater Arapal has been occupied, and at this point, Marmont sees that opportunity. He sees the chance to use the Greater Arapal as a pivot behind which he can flick his army around behind and send them on an outflanking march. What this will mean is that he can push Wellington all the way back to the Portuguese border. He's got no choice because his lines of communication run from Salamanca all the way west to Ciudad Rodrigo. If he doesn't move back, Marmont's going to cut his lines of communication, and that would be catastrophic. So this forces Wellington into a kind of a mirroring maneuver. So he occupies the heights above the village of Los Arapiles and begins to prepare for that return. Now, before I talk about how things start to go wrong, I just want to give you an indication of the landscape that we're looking at. So on your screen now is what is meant to be video footage, which now isn't playing through. Apologies for this, folks. Just give me a second. Okay, we're having some technical difficulties. Bear with me. Right, well, this isn't how it's meant to happen. We have lost that footage. Let's try this instead. Nope, that's not playing through either. Okay, bear with me a second. Workaround. So I'll just mute this because you don't need the background noise. This is the area of the battlefield around a region known as the Chapel of Nuestra Senora de la Peña. I've paused the footage here. In the center of your shot right now, you can see the two arapals. The lesser arapal is on the right-hand side, the greater arapal on the left-hand side. As this shot pans round, you will see that by occupying the greater arapal, it means that you dominate all of this ground to the left. And we are standing here at on the French position. So this region was occupied by General Foy's division, and Marmont was able to use the arapal as a pivot point behind which he could swing his army round to the west. It's a stunning piece of landscape. This is possibly my favorite place in the entire world, genuinely. I absolutely adore Salamanca. I love the region, an absolutely beautiful part of the world. I'm just going to play it through again for you. So in the center there is the chapel, or it's a hermitage now, Nuestra Senora de la Peña. This was the site of skirmishing over the course of the battle. It's the only fighting that really happens here. And it's relatively minor. It's the one part of the battlefield that's quite quiet. As we pan across, on the far side, right there in the center of shot, is where the light division was deployed. Now, for all that history has led us to believe that Wellington almost couldn't win a battlefield if his wonderful lads in green jackets of the 95th Rifles weren't with him, the 95th Rifles don't actually do much over the course of Salamanca. This is a very, very quiet battle for them. So you have some skirmishing here, but as I just continue to pan around to complete the shot, this is the region where that's of real interest. Just that perspective that you get, you can see how much of a misjudgment it was for Wellington. I'll just reround it a little bit. For Wellington to not understand the significance of the Greater Arapal, occupy that, and you dominate the ground to the south. As you're going to see a little bit later, we don't have a very good indication of what the landscape looked like. What the Greater Arapal originally looked like, because the back end of it was used as a quarry. Literally, they just carved huge chunks of stone out of it. So what we see of the Greater Arapal today is not the full picture, sadly. So that's the extreme right of the battlefield. Let's take that down now. And I'm going to start to give you a little bit of the geographic context at this point. So what you have here is good old trusty Google Maps, because hey, why not? We'll just close Taylor Swift in the background there. So this is the region that in question. So there is Salamanca to the north, as you've seen through the map. You've got Valladolid, Toro. You've got Ciudad Rodrigo over to the west here, and we're just going to zoom in on Arapiles, which is the nearest village. So the French actually know this battle as the Battle of Los Arapiles, named after the Greater Arapiles, Greater Arapal, as I pronounce it, which is probably a mispronunciation. and then the lesser one, which is this one here, the Arapiles Chico. It's much better in Spanish than it is in English. So you can see this is where the chapel is, Chapel of the Hermitage of Nuestra Señora de la Peña. So you've got Foy's division here, you've got the light division in this part here. Now, having occupied the Greater Arapil, what it means, as I've said, is that Marmont can begin to move his men west. And that's a pretty successful maneuver, except just a little bit of an error creeps into this. Not a big error. Rory Muir has written the book on this, so if you want to go up and read up on this afterwards, go and find Rory Muir's Salamanca 1812. It is one of the best battlefield studies I have read in my entire career as a historian. Absolutely phenomenal book. Should be on everybody's reading list if they want to know how to write good military history, because it doesn't just tell the story of the battle, it shows you the complexity and how there is so much contradiction in the sources from this battle. So Rory Muir has said that, this wasn't a fatal error. This is something that could have been corrected given just a little bit of time and a little bit more luck, quite frankly. Luck on the French side in not being faced with Wellington, and luck on the French side in that Marmont gets wounded at the crucial moment in time. I personally think that that's actually used as a little bit of an excuse by Marmont to cover the fact that he screws up a little bit here. But nonetheless, we can talk about that a little bit more later on. So two divisions end up just slightly outstripping their support. So Wellington puts the 4th Division up here, the 5th Division under Leith up here, and then over at Aldea Tejada, which is up on the top left of your screen, he places the 3rd Division under Ned Pakenham. Meanwhile, Marmont's sending troops west. So Thomier marches along this, what is a ridge of high ground here. This is known as the Monte de Azan, towards Miranda de Azan. 3rd Division here under Ned Pakenham is really meant to cover the retreat. So what Wellington has in mind is that his force is going to move off to the sort of northwest region, and it will be the 3rd Division that do the holding of the line. They'll become the rear guard. But as Thomier marches a bit too far along the Monte d'Azan, so too does McCune, just move a little bit too far to the left. Not catastrophically, by any stretch of the imagination. Thomier is probably in more of a dangerous position than McCune. But Wellington sees the opportunity here. The story goes that he was at the observation point, which is roughly where my cursor is now, and was eating dinner, eating chicken, apparently, and declared, "By God, that will do." No idea if he said it quite like that, but I liked the bit of dramatic flair there. And he throws the chicken leg over his shoulder, talk about wasting a good dinner, and rides off to speak to Ned Pakenham, because he's seen that Thomier and McCune have outstripped their support. You've got other divisions that are feeding through. So the 120th Ligne and Bonnet's division are in the region around the Greater Arapil. You've got Taupin. Taupin's division is sort of marching round in this division, in this direction, and the idea is that he will then support. But Thomier is all the way out here. He's gone far too far, quite frankly. He's kind of created a bit of space between himself and McCune, which is dangerous. McCune, meanwhile, doesn't have direct contact at the point at which Wellington gives the orders to strike in order to have all the support that he needs to fend off an attack. So Wellington sends in two divisions. 3rd Division, as we discussed, comes down from here, Aldea de Tejada towards Miranda de Azan. And then the 5th Division comes across frontally from the heights above the village of Los Arapiles, about a mile. We're talking about 6,000 men here, travelling a distance of about a mile along a front 900 yards long to attack McCune. But I promised you battlefield footage. So what does all of this actually look like in practice? Let's see if the tech wants to play ball now. No, it doesn't. So we will try this another way. Apologies, folks. We are live and anything can happen. So let's put that in instead, and this should work. So this, let me just pause it. There we go, and I'll rewind. So, live TV, it's always a joy. So over here, sorry, you can't see that because you haven't got a cursor on your screen, have you? In the center of your picture, you've got a section of low ground. In that low ground is Aldea Tejada. That is where the 3rd Division were deployed. Wellington rides over and speaks directly to Pakenham and gives the orders in person. His orders are, go attack the French. Now, the story goes that he physically points out the location of Thomier's division to Pakenham, which means that the conversation definitely didn't happen where I shot this footage. I partly stopped here because the field of poppies is just absolutely stunning, and I'm partly showing you something because you'll notice that you've got this ridgeline across the middle of your shot. That ridgeline effectively masks Pakenham's advance. There's been a lot of discussion about why is it that the French don't see this coming. An entire division is hard to hide, but when you, and you're going to see this in just a second, when you actually stand on the ground and look at it, it becomes increasingly clear that actually the French can't see what's coming. So the Miranda de Zan is actually the other side of this rise, and this road to the right hand side of the shot right there more or less traces the route that Pakenham and his division would have taken. So the 3rd Division are on the march. Let's take that down and show you this from a different angle. And I'm not going to trust the preloaded content at this point. I'm just going to have to import it directly. So this makes the point that little bit better. Bear with me. There we go. So I'm just going to let this play through. That's the area that the division would have marched across. But then look at this on the left hand side. As you get closer to that ridgeline that you saw, you can see the extent to which actually Pakenham's men are completely masked. And that point is reinforced even further when you look at this. So this is, there we go. This is the ground over which Pakenham's men actually attacked. So he deploys into, there's a lot of debate actually about quite how this unit, the 3rd Division, ends up deploying, but fundamentally the accepted version is we get 2 brigades advancing frontally up the Monte de Azan. So in the front line was Wallace's brigade, which had the 88th, the 45th and the 74th battalions, regiments in them. And what you're looking at right there is the hill that they would have marched up. So you can just make out the strip of grey tarmac through the middle of your shot. That's a modern road. But the ground drops away incredibly rapidly. We're talking maybe 100 feet in the space of a few meters. So Wallace's men had to scramble up this. But if you look beyond that kind of section of low ground, at the region more widely, look to the horizon. You can't see that dirt track that the other footage you were just shown was shot from. And that's precisely the point. It sits in this section of dead ground. That means they wouldn't have seen anything coming apart from maybe the dust cloud. And a dust cloud can mean more or less anything. So Wallace's men scramble up this hill and they actually arrive at it ever so slightly too late. So the leading regiments, apologies folks, I'm just going to pause what I'm saying because Mark Ducks is coming come in through the chat, and please do make use of the chat function. Part of the fun is to have a discussion about this. So post your questions, post your comments. I'm also endeavouring to keep an eye on social media, but it is a tiny bit difficult. Aidan saying it's greener than I expected, and he's just commenting about his wargaming bases and saying that he's put dried mud on his wargaming figures for Salamanca. Bear in mind, time of year matters. So this was shot in May, I believe. Yeah, I think it was May. And it was much cooler and much greener. So Salamanca takes place in July. It would have been very arid, very dry, very yellow. Mark comes in and just says, when reading about Salamanca, in his naivety, he imagined flat central Spain and the two Arapaza's as heights. It's much more complicated in reality. Case of walking the ground, changing views. Absolutely, Mark. There is no alternative to walking the ground. I'll give you. So I'm sitting here very confidently, sort of telling you all of this stuff. It takes some working out. So when I shot that first snippet of footage that I showed you, looking at Pakenham's advance, I actually got on the phone, video called a friend of mine, a former soldier, and we just kind of discussed, actually, this doesn't make sense in terms of what I was expecting, and tried to work out how does all of this fit together. And it's only once you've walked the ground and then looked back that you start to understand these things. But yes, back to this footage. So Wallace's brigade would have attacked in exactly that direction. Thomier's men were marching along this section of height. It then sort of dips away and rises again very quickly. I'll show you some footage of that in just a second. But they arrive a tad too late. They've had support cavalry come with them in the form of Durban. Now, Durban's men end up having to sort of do a dual thing of fending off the French cavalry under light cavalry under a guy called Curto, and then also they charge in support of the 3rd Division, and they've managed to break the leading battalion of Thomier's division, which therefore helps the situation. It enables Wallace's men to keep that advance, but they do have to advance under some pretty stiff fire. And as they do so, this is what they are faced with. So we'll take that one down and add this one in. Apologies, I had all of this preloaded in, but the tech doesn't want to play ball, so we're doing it the hard way. So this is... We'll take the wind noise out. So this is further along the Monte d'Azan, not by much, a couple of 100 meters, and you can see that the ground has shifted slightly. So there is a lip to the Monte d'Azan, which you can see here. So imagine this from the French perspective. You're marching forward, confidently expecting to just keep on marching off into the horizon. And then suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, you see your mates come running past you, and then suddenly there's this line of redcoats. It's not a wonder that they were badly shaken by what unfolded. And the results are depressingly predictable. Thomier's division ends up being shattered. There's no other word for it. There's no other way of phrasing it. It means that an entire French division is not wiped out, but it's broken. It plays no further part in the battle. So that's what happens to Thomier's troops. Now let's move on to talk about Maucune. Remember that the 5th Division under Leith have been sent to attack Maucune's division. But it's not just the story of Leith and the 5th Division, because in come the British heavy cavalry. Now, Wellington has a problem with cavalry all the way through his career, whether it's Waterloo, right at the end of his military career, whether it's early in his campaigning life at Vimero, they're a problem. At Talavera, they are definitely a problem. And it's this tendency for British cavalry to be an almost fire and forget weapon. That tendency to charge in and inflict devastating losses, but then not rally. Partly, people have suggested to me maybe this is about the fact that Wellington doesn't have enough cavalry. Wellington's certainly of the opinion that they don't consider their position. You see that particularly at Waterloo. We'll do a live stream of Waterloo at some point, not at Waterloo. Logistically, that's too complicated. But it's also a problem here. So in charges Le Marchand's heavy cavalry in one of the most devastatingly successful British cavalry assaults of the war. Not the most, but one of them. And this is the ground over which Thomier has to retreat. So if we just pause it there, you can see that that agriculturally farmed field. That's where you just saw me filming from a moment ago. This is the area over which Thomier has to withdraw over, and then as it pans round, that is the area over which Le Marchand's heavy cavalry charge, heading to the right of shot. So if I pause it there, you can now see the lesser and the greater Arapal on the right hand side of your picture, and then McCune's men were on the heights right in the center of shot now. So you have to imagine Le Marchand's heavy cavalry charging across shot, heading for the area just to the right of the Greater Arapal. So the Greater Arapal is in the middle of shot, and that's the area to the right is where Le Marchand's heavy cavalry were aiming for. Now, all of this is happening at a really difficult moment for the French, because the French have been deprived of their leader. By freak chance, British artillery manages to fire a shell from the Lesser Arapal to the Greater Arapal, which explodes near Marshal Marmont. Now, it is claimed that at this point, Marmont was in the midst of climbing onto his horse, and he claimed that he was about to ride off to tell Thomier and McCune, hold up, stop marching so far, we've got a bit of a problem here, I need you to wait here whilst I then bring up some reinforcements to support you and plug the gaps, and then everything will be lovely, and then you can carry on your way. One small problem with that: why is Marmont riding off to give the orders in person when it's a very simple halt order that could be dealt with by an ADC? He could give that order to a member of his staff. Now, the counter that's been suggested is that actually maybe Marmont saw Wellington on the move and thought, actually, I need to be there. I need to be in that location so that I can command that part of the field personally. And there's an argument to be made for that. The bulk of his reinforcements are based around the Greater Arapal at this point. So again, let me just give you the Google Maps so that you can see what we're talking about here. So by this point, the 3rd Division are here. So straight across the Monte d'Azan, and are marching east. They are advancing, the plan being that they are now going to wrap around the flank of McCune. The heavy cavalry are coming in from this direction, and they are going to hit the flank of McCune's division. They're actually also going to end up getting slightly tangled with some of Thomier's men as well, and some of Topaz's men. It all gets a little bit messy as this whole French left flank just ends up crumpling almost like a paper bag. So Marmont's here watching this unfold, and he claims he's about to ride off to get involved. Now, I can buy the idea that Marmont might have been riding off to take personal command. That's a very Wellingtonian thing to do. It's exactly what Wellington does. He gives the orders to Pakenham, then rides over to Leith with the 5th Division and gives the orders in person. That's very much Wellington's style as a micromanager. It's also a reflection, and partly why I've called this session Wellington's Viper Strike, because it's that case of Wellington taking a moment when he's on the defensive and then just whipping around in the blink of an eye and striking with such venom and such ferocity and such force that it devastates the French army. So perhaps Marmont was riding off to take personal command. If that's the case, I do question why we haven't had a stronger sense of that from the surviving source material. But I'm always open to alternative suggestions on this. This is my reading of the situation, and half the fun of history is that not everybody, nobody can ever say with 100% accuracy, because the witnesses to the event are dead, and sure, they left behind writings, but they weren't exactly unbiased in doing so. So a lot of the support for the French army is manoeuvring its way around the back of the Greater Arapal. Bonnet's division is occupying this region here behind the Greater Arapal, and then in comes a freak shot. Quite frankly, nobody can pretend that this was aimed or intended, but a shell comes looping over from the Greater Arapal, where both sides have installed artillery on these, because you would, quite obviously, they dominate the landscape. You put artillery there, you can hit things for a heck of a long distance. In comes a shell, and it explodes and knocks Marmont off his horse. He breaks an arm. He doesn't lose the arm, but it means that he is out of the battle. Now, at this moment in time, the command is meant to devolve on General Clausel, but there's a problem, because another shell has gone off near Clausel, and he's getting a piece of shrapnel removed from, I believe, his heel. So Clausel isn't available to take command, but nobody knows that at that point in time apart from Clausel's staff. So off ride the ADCs to tell Clausel to take over command, except that he can't be found because he's having his heel bandaged. At which point then command devolves on General Bonnet. Fine. But then General Bonnet gets wounded by British artillery fire. So what you then have is a situation where people go, okay, what next? And at this point, Clausel has had his treatment and he's come back, wounded as he is, to take personal command. But what it means is that you've got this crucial hour, and all of this happens in the space of an afternoon. So the first manoeuvres are probably happening somewhere in the region between 2:30 and 3:15. And the battle is, the French are defeated by about 6:30. So you have this situation for a vital hour. The French are trying to work out who's in command. The big decisions are not being made. They are basically rudderless for a vital span of the battle. And that unquestionably helps Wellington no end, because not everything goes his way. But we'll get to that in just a moment. So we're going to focus now on the fighting here, McCune's efforts to fend off the British assault. So again, apologies, tech playing havoc with me. Let me just bring this in. So what we're going to have here is the view from Wellington's position. Let me just mute that. So you can see the Great Arapal just disappearing on the left of shot, and this is the ground over which he is observing everything that unfolds. So all of this is filmed from what is now a sort of quasi-memorial. It's not a proper memorial, but it's a sort of observation and information point on the battlefield. Quite hard to get to. You've got to be very, very careful, and you will have seen this from on the... Sorry, I've just got one eye on comments that are coming in as well. You will have seen this from the footage that I've shot, that actually I've been very careful in terms of where I have trodden, because if a field is farmed, it is privately owned, and you need to not be trespassing on that land. And you also, very importantly, need to not be ruining a farmer's crops. So you have to be incredibly careful about where you walk and where you are and aren't allowed to go. There are ways to access these places, but it is quite hard to get to this point from the front end. From the back end is fine. From this end, the French side, however, it's much harder to get there. But as you can see, this is the ridge of high ground, the Monte d'Azan, and then appearing in the right of shot is the village of Los Arapiles. So Leith's men would have been positioned on the high ground that you're looking at right now. So in they go. They're ordered forward by Wellington. So you're viewing this from the position of the alleged, by God that will do, chicken leg over the shoulder shot. You can see the ground that they're advancing over. It's quite clear. It's not broken ground. and that's ideal for cavalry. So if we now look at this from the position of McCune, you can you can see what he was up against. So this is McCune's perspective. It's a little bit forward of where he positioned his men, and you can see it's just a gentle slope. He's on high ground, but it is gentle ground. So over there is roughly where Le Marchant's heavy cavalry would have charged him. And then McCune positions his men just the other side of that rise that you've got in the center of shot. So I've gone a little bit forward so you can get that full perspective of the ground that Leith's men advance over. So just to look at it again, so the village of Los Arapals is in the center of your shot now. The high ground is where the 5th Division advanced from, distance of about a mile, and they marched effectively straight up this hill. When they get there, they're devastatingly successful. So the front line, there are 2 lines to Leith's formation. The front line consists of, apologies, I'm just consulting a map here, the 4th Regiment, the 3rd Battalion, 1st Regiment, the 38th, the 1st 38th, the 2nd 38th, and the 9th. Now, a number of those units actually form part of a core of troops that Wellington calls upon time and again over the course of the Peninsular War, and they are incredibly effective. They are helped, though, in no small part by Le Marchant also charging in at the same time. I mean, I'm just going to pause in order to look at a few questions that have come in. So 10 minutes ago, Noah, nice to see you, Noah. Were there any, in your view, errors in terms of the disposition and movements of the French light cavalry on the left flank regarding detecting what would have been the front in front of Thomier on a tactical level? Great question. I would like to read a little bit more in terms of the material from Curto himself, if it's available. And I haven't had that opportunity yet. My sense from their placement is that Curto really mucks this up. Part of the reason that things are so bad for Thomier's men is because of an inadequate job on the part of Curto. They don't play a huge role. They do sort of attempt to charge in once, but then get forced off and don't really do much. I think, generally speaking, Curto screws up. Sure, there will have been efforts to scout ahead, but when you look at the positioning of Curto, and actually, I tell you what, I can bring up a video just to demonstrate this point. I was originally going to have this loaded in, but I skipped it because of the tech issues. So let's load that in now. So we've gone back to the end, the western end of the Monte d'Azam, which is what you can see on the right-hand side of shot. What you have to the left is Miranda d'Azam, the village, and it's over that area that Curto's men are deployed, which is great, except that the British are over on the right-hand side of shot, so they're beyond the right-hand side of frame, which means that Curto's men are fundamentally in completely the wrong position. And you can partly say, well, look, part of that is going to be that he's been moved up and they've used the Greater Arapal as a pivot, and so he's just kind of moving himself into position. Sure, but they drop the ball. There's no denying that. They get surprised by the cavalry, then they get surprised by the infantry. So for me, a lot of this does actually sit at a local level on Curto. So thank you for that, Noah. Then Neil, just saying, it's years since I was there, but what struck me was that however far west Thomier's French marched, there always seemed to be a hillock still further to the west for them to take. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That really struck me as well. I didn't manage to walk the whole of the position. This part of the battlefield is actually sort of cut in half by a motorway, but I didn't get the chance to walk all of this section from Miranda d'Azam to the motorway because I knackered my ankle. So, you know, discretion, the better part of valor. But yes, it is quite surprising that it does. There's always something else just sort of masking your view of the skyline until you get to the absolute lip, which, you know, then you have Wallace's men coming up that. So you're absolutely right to raise that. And Neil suggests, well, you know, perhaps that's part of the reason why they overextended. Yeah, very plausible. You know, can I have a better line of sight? But again, that's kind of a problem, right? In terms of overall command and seeing that bigger picture. So we've got 2 comments coming in here from John Percival. Nice to see you, John. Talking about the footage of the battlefields, it makes you appreciate the distances involved, yes, and the tight control and coordination that Wellington had over his army. And then some, actually, because as we're going to discuss, not only has Wellington got things positioned in a way that you would think is just a standard defensive position, but then suddenly seems to miraculously turn into this vicious strike. But he's also got defense in depth, which means that when things go wrong with the 4th division, which we're going to get to in a second, it's amazing how he's just got the forces exactly where he needs them to move the 6th division into the gap created by the 4th division breaking, and the problem is solved. So it's incredible. It gives you a real appreciation of just how good Wellington was, quite frankly, how he is clearly considering multiple variables at multiple points in time. This battle doesn't unfold by luck. It simply doesn't. So it's remarkable the way in which he clearly had that capacity to see a number of variables all at once. Neil coming in, always happy to reference Roy Muir when it comes to this, well, when it comes to this conflict generally. Actually, he's just the GOAT, quite frankly. Roy Muir makes clear that Curto lagged behind Thomier, only engaged Pakenham and the Allied cavalry with less than half his division. Yeah, that's been my understanding of the situation as well. Just not where he needs to be, fundamentally. Poor work on the part of Curto there. Geraint, hello Geraint, good to see you. Memory is hazy, but wasn't some of the French force deployed in line rather than in column? Depends which part of the French force you're talking about, Geraint, if I'm completely honest. And it's so McCune's division is ready to a degree for what's coming at them. They have deployed in line. They deploy behind the lip of the ridge that I was just showing in the previous video. So yes, they're in line. When it comes to Thomier's men, it's a very higgledy-piggledy mess. So you've got some troops that are broken. You've got others trying to shake themselves into a fighting line because they can kind of get the sense of something's going wrong and we need to be ready to fight. But the fundamental story is that they're caught on the hop, and it seems from some of the accounts that certainly some of Thomier's division are caught in column, which doesn't help their case any. They almost sort of walk headlong into this. Folks, just a quick pause to say, please remember to whack that like button. It helps a heck of a lot. And if you are willing, please do also share it so that it reaches a wider audience. It will take 2 seconds of your time, but it makes a big difference in terms of the algorithm. So go smack that like button if you're watching. And I can see there are a few of you watching, so please do give it a prod. And also just a quick shameless plug and reminder that if you'd like to support the channel, please do by heading over to Ko-fi in order to drop a one-off tip, or if you fancy immersing yourself into the Napoleonic Wars pod universe with the socials, with like-minded Napoleonic nerds, courses, exclusive perks, exclusive episodes, discounts, and much more besides, head over to patreon.com/Napoleonic Wars pod, where you will find all the information on that good stuff that is available. Right, back to the battle itself, though. Where have we got to in the course of proceedings? So let's just take a quick look at the area that McCune puts his line, effectively. So give me a second, because again, the tech is being a headache. Let's bring this in now. So this is where McCune's line is based. So the footage that you saw earlier was taken just a touch down the track. This is the lip of the ridge, and McCune's forces are deployed across this. So just the other side, they're doing a Wellington, if you like. So Wellington's always lauded for the reverse slope mentality, and that's not unique to him. McCune sees what's coming and he does exactly what needs to be done. Smart move, fundamentally. Folks, also keep your questions coming in. Todd Campbell, evening Todd, asking, so given this unexpected hit on the French left flank by the British, what was the morale of the French at this point in time? Shaken, I would say, by this point at this point, but bear in mind that all of these events almost sort of end up happening not exactly in isolation of each other, because obviously they're all part of a wider battle. But think how far you can see when gun smoke is involved. So visibility is good if you're in the right places on a clear day. However, when you add gun smoke into the mix and you're in the middle of a fighting line, you haven't got the ability to just sort of say, hang on, lads, I'm going to have a quick look at what's happening. So you'll be aware that there are flashes and bangs going on around you, but you'll be very much focused on what's immediately in front of you. And the French fight hard. This is not as though these guys are cowards who just give up and run away. They fight incredibly tenaciously throughout this battle. And you're going to see this with Ferry's last stand as well. Certainly they'll have been shaken. They'll have been rattled by this. But it's not as though they just give up and run for home. Second comment coming in from Todd. Forces are spread out, but I imagine there was some doubt in their minds of winning the day. I don't think most have the viewpoint in order to be able to have the capacity to think about that and form any kind of opinions. They'll just be aware that there's fighting going on. And then if those flashes and bangs are suddenly happening behind them, that's a much bigger point of concern. That's the point at which morale will begin to waver and crumble. So that is what you've had on screen here. Let me just play it through again. Is the area occupied by McCune. So they are broken comprehensively. The first line and the second line, Leith ends up being wounded actually by a musket ball in the course of this fighting, but the first line gets broken by a bayonet charge. Then the division pushes on, engages the second line that McCune has drawn up, and then they also are broken, and in sweeps Le Marchand to take apart the remainder. And this is exactly what heavy cavalry dream of, a field with a broken enemy. The ground is pretty open, as you can see. If we just bring it back a little bit, this is not difficult terrain for cavalry. The soil is a bit rocky. You can see that particularly when the fields are ploughed, but it's still really good ground for cavalry. The trouble is they do end up being sucked in to a fight with Topin's division. Remember what I said, if we go back to the Google Maps, the Topin has been moving men up in support here, and the leading battalions end up being mauled by Le Marchand. Le Marchand, however, dies in the course of this fight. There is a lot of debate about eagles. The famous line is that 2 French eagles get taken. There have been murmurings about a third that are hotly debated. Some sources seem to indicate that actually this might have been a jingling Johnny rather than a true eagle. And there's some interesting research that's come to light recently by Gary Wills, which I haven't sadly had the opportunity to catch up on yet, because there's always something else to read. But I'm going to sit down with Gary at some point and talk through this, probably as a podcast episode. But he has delved into the French sources, and he seems to have found evidence to suggest that none of the eagles were lost by McCune's men, that they kept all 4. So curious in terms of the contradictions here, curious in terms of the discrepancies between source material. Either you've got an eagle or you haven't got an eagle. Which is it? Nonetheless, what this means is that by the mid to late afternoon, Thomier's division broken, Topin's division badly mauled, and pulls off towards the southeast. McCune's division, broken. That's 3 French divisions that have taken a bad hammering. But things are about to tip. So Wellington has sent in the 4th Division to attack Clausel, who, if we return to this, our trusty map of the battle, is positioned to the right-hand side of the Monte d'Azan. So in goes the 4th Division. Trouble is, 4th Division is the weakest in the Allied army, and they end up getting absolutely swamped. They get mugged, to not put too fine a point on it, because Pax Portuguese Brigade are also ordered to attack the Greater Arapal. So if we now flick back to the Google Maps, so Pax, we're focusing on this part of the field now. So Lesser Arapal, Greater Arapal, Pax force are sent in to partly take the Greater Arapal, but also push in this direction here, behind which Bonnet has the rest of his entire division. So 120th Ligne occupy the top part. The rest of it is not exactly skulking, but they're behind the Greater Arapal. So they then sally out from behind it, hit parts of it, hit 4th Division, parts of it also swamped the Portuguese Brigade, and Clausel is having none of this. So he's back in command at this point, and he orders, he breaks the 4th Division with his own division, and then orders a push through. So this is the point at which it gets quite dicey for the British, except that Wellington has defense in depth. Let's bring up a zoomed in map. So these maps are hand drawn. They're obviously not precise. They're drawn by me. So Clausel kind of pivots his division in order to deal with the fact that he's now got these flanking forces coming round his left flank, but then sends Bonnet in a follow-up to try and exploit this gap that's opened up. The idea being, okay, the left is gone. I am the left flank now. However, Wellington's centre is wavering. It's crumpling. 4th Division are pulling back. They pull back behind 6th Division, reform, and return to the battle later in the evening. 6th Division, though, up just behind 4th Division. And this is what I was suggesting earlier about Wellington having everything poised where he needs it to be to have this defence in depth. Behind 5th Division was 7th Division. Behind 4th Division was 6th Division. That meant that even if the first wave wasn't successful, there was a follow-up wave coming that meant that he could either regroup or he could push on through and exploit any gaps. So it really gives you an inkling into Wellington having eyes on so many possibilities at this point in time. This is, in my opinion, Wellington's best moment, his greatest victory. The one in which he comes closest to having an Austerlitz moment. But Salamanca isn't an Austerlitz. So Bonnet is sent in to try and exploit this gap, but then in comes the 6th Division and they break Bonnet's division. That therefore means you now have 4 French divisions that are broken. Clausel's men also take a hammering as various parts of the Allied army begin to move in. Basically, a noose is tightening around the French army's neck, and there's little for it, quite frankly. At this point, there is very little that can be done, which leaves us to probably the most heroic moment, for me at least, for the French army during this entire battle, which hopefully is going to be covered by this.
With the French left and centre broken, the Greater Arapal had to be abandoned by the 120th Ligne of Bonnet's division because it simply risked being outflanked by the Allies. 4 French divisions had now been shattered, but in the dying light, another was to suffer even further. Ferry's division was given the unenviable task of trying to cover the French retreat, fending off the Allied army for a crucial hour until darkness fell. If they couldn't succeed in that task, then even greater havoc would have been wrought amongst their allies. They did everything that could have reasonably been asked of them, forming up here at El Cierro with their backs to the tree line. Threats of cavalry on their flanks meant that the flank battalions had to form into square. That was fine into defence against cavalry, but it meant that they were sitting targets for Allied musketry and artillery fire. Ferry's division lost 1,001 men, including Ferry himself, who was cut in half by a cannonball. But they did buy the French army time. They slipped off, broken as the darkness descended, leaving Wellington scrambling to try and work out in which direction they had gone. Allied victory at Salamanca was not the end of the Peninsular War, nor was it even the beginning of the end. The scale of the defeat for the French has been overstated. It's been described as the defeat of 40,000 men in 40 minutes, which isn't quite fair. A better assessment perhaps comes from General Foy, who fought here, who described this as a battle in the style of Frederick the Great, which raised Wellington almost to the level of Marlborough. Between this defeat at Salamanca and Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia, it was clear that at both ends of the continent, the French were not winning the Napoleonic Wars. The tide was well and truly turning, and Salamanca was a key part of that.
So that's me trying to have my Dan Snow moment. So a little bit of a spoiler in terms of some of the footage that was shot during my visit out there, and perhaps a little bit of a taste of what may be to come, provided the documentary actually gets made. Geraint with a couple of comments. Greater than Nivelle or Thez or Asai in your view? Yes, Geraint, quite simply. Not taking anything away from Nivelle or Thez or Asai. Asai, Wellington is the one who thinks Asai is his greatest, and granted, he's the person who ought to know. But for me, Salamanca is just, it's that flick. You know, Asai Wellington's already on the offensive, and actually he then sees the Maratha shift and has to attack frontally. So it wasn't actually the enveloping sort of flank sweep that was intended. But for me, Salamanca it's that moment of, here's the opportunity and I'm going to take it. It gives you such a good indication of the guy not only having that extra capacity that I've talked about at length already, but having that eye for the slightest opening. It shows how dangerous Wellington is. On a good day, he's absolutely blisteringly lethal. So yes, is the short answer to that question. Geraint, it seems, is a fan of Zack with beard, duly noted. Not everybody is a fan. And we have appreciation coming in from Mark for General, so it's General Foy, actually, I believe is the French pronunciation, General Foy, who you'll remember I said was commanding at the Chapel of Nuestra Senora de la Peña. And it's his memoir from which that is taken. And Neil's just coming in saying greater also in terms of political effects across Europe, e.g. in Russia on the Tsar. Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about Legacies in a moment, but yes, this is, so I would be the first to acknowledge that the Peninsular War is by no means the thing that shatters Napoleonic control over Europe. But what you get out of the Peninsular War is this drip feeding of the French have been beaten, the French have been beaten, the French have been beaten, the French have been beaten. And who have they been beaten by? They've been beaten by this guy that initially nobody had even heard of, Sir Arthur Wellesley. Who's that? Sure, he gets elevated to Wellington after Talavera, but this name keeps cropping up. And this is the British army that are doing this, and nobody's got any time for the British at the start of the Peninsular War. They just haven't. Genuinely, the British army is almost a joke to many in Europe. It's what's it done before this point? It's done Copenhagen. There'll be a live stream about that because Copenhagen's a sickening episode. We basically go and firebomb the Danish capital in order to steal their ships so that Napoleon can't get his hands on them. Copenhagen is not impressive. Egypt isn't that impressive in the grand scheme of things. Not really. It's not, Austerlitz or Marengo or anything like that. The bulk of what the British Army has done, apart from its expedition to Flanders in the 1790s, which goes catastrophically wrong, and from which allegedly we get that nursery rhyme, the Grand Old Duke of York, is grabbing colonies. So the fact that you've got this British force, even though the British are supremely confident they can absolutely handle anything the French throw at them, but that's just, jingoism fundamentally, which is slightly anachronistic to use that phrase, but that's essentially what we're looking at here. What it means is that you've got this French force that is repeatedly being hammered by a British force, and everybody's sort of going, what the heck is this? It's not like the Spanish defeating the French at Balen, which is such a shock, because everybody's going, sorry, that the Spanish have done this. And what transpires, of course, is that Balen is a bit of a one-off. That's not to be rude about Spanish forces, but they're not quite it, to be utterly frank. But with this repeated drip feeding, it does bolster morale across Europe and create this sense that actually, no, you can beat these guys. You've got to know what you're doing in terms of tactics. You've got to take your moments, but it is physically possible to win. It rips away that veneer of invincibility from Napoleon's army, not from Napoleon himself. And it's not until Russia that actually people get the sense that, yeah, Napoleon can be defeated as well. So, yes, I would agree with that. Sorry, I've gone off on quite a ranty tangent there, but I'm completely on board with what you say there, Neil. Noah, just saying, with this and having watched your Boney's Boys in Spain with Josh Proven, that was certainly a podcast episode that was done a long time back, actually. I can't remember if we released a YouTube video off the back of it as well. It just says that his general sense in relation to administrative skills and intelligence, Marmont is underrated in his view. That's certainly my view. I think a lot of the discussion about Marmont ends up centering on the fact that he doesn't do much that's impressive, and has some bad campaigns in 1813 and 14. And then, of course, he surrenders his army to the Allies in 1814, which is seen as catastrophic failure to support Napoleon, big betrayal. Now, I'm going to be biased by the fact that I'm not Napoleon's greatest fan. So I question the extent to which there's an element of seeing the writing on the wall in 1814. But that's something for us to debate. But I think that ends up eclipsing a lot. And because of that, people perhaps go looking for reasons to criticise Marmont. And you do get people sort of going, oh, Wellington, all he could do was defeat Marmont because Marmont was rubbish. And that misses the point of what I've talked about over the course of this session, that actually Marmont's on the cusp of winning the campaign. And to get the upper hand on Wellington during a campaign is not a mean feat. It's not easily done. So, consider the fact that Napoleon doesn't manage to best the Allies, albeit that Napoleon is very much not the Napoleon of Austerlitz when he fights Wellington at Waterloo. So just because you get beaten by Wellington doesn't necessarily mean that you're rubbish. Back to the footage, though, there's just one other thing that I want to show you. And this is the view from the Greater Arapal, which gives you an appreciation. I'll just mute the wind there. It gives you an appreciation of the landscape. So this is, where are we? I just need to get my bearings in terms of this. Yeah, Neil, actually, I'll just pause this a second. Neil comes in with a very good point. Duke of Ragusa, Raguser is now to betray in French. So if you betray somebody, you are quite literally doing a Marmont in French. Gives you an indication of the ridicule and the disdain with which he was treated at the time in France, and the debate continues to this day. So thanks for that, Neil. Folks, as ever, keep the questions coming in. We're about to wrap up, but I'm going to show you a little bit more and give you a little bit more of an indication of the Legacies of Salamanca. So if you've got any questions, now is the moment to post them, and I will answer anything that I can in the chat once we are done. But returning to this, so this is the footage that I shot from the Greater Arapal. So if I just pause it there, you might just be able to see a little needle in the sort of center right of your shot right now. That is the monument to the French. Sorry, the monument to all sides. It's the Salamanca monument, actually. It's in a horribly weathered state. I believe it's about 100 years old. As you can see, it's in a very exposed location. It's horribly deteriorating. They've had to stick a new plaque on it recently to just make sure that it actually says something. And then as you pan around to the right, what you're going to see there is the Lesser Arapal. So this is the ground over which Pack and the 4th Division attack. And then if we rewind the footage a little bit to that, so this is the area that the French have to vacate. So initially occupied by Bonnet, and then you can see the tree line there, which is occupied by Ferry as part of the French final stand. Except that that's debated. So again, Gary Wills has done some research that leads him to question, based on the French sources, if they actually pulled up there. He thinks it might be further off towards the horizon. Again, I need to sit down and really go to town on Gary's work there to work out what I feel the reality is of that. But always open to discussion and possibilities. So that's it in terms of the battlefield footage that I'm going to share with you. So I just want to say a little bit about the legacies of Salamanca. What you have here is not only a catastrophic defeat of a French army, 50,000 men, about equal weighting to 48 to 50,000 men, depends on the estimates that you've got in front of you at the time. Not only is this force shattered, but it's about that psychological ascendancy. Marmont thought that he had Wellington on the ropes. He thought he was about to force Wellington all the way back to Ciudad Rodrigo without firing a single shot. This would have been something that he could have touted as a great success story back in France. But for the space of half an hour's staff work, Wellington seizes a narrow window of opportunity and virtually rips the guy's head off. It's staggering, as you've seen, the ability to pivot from a defensive posture into an aggressive one and comprehensively inflict the defeats on the French in echelon. The following day, Foy's division receives similar treatment at Garcia Hernandez. That is described as the most audacious British cavalry charge of the entire Peninsular War by General Foy, who was in command. And effectively, it's freak chance. So some French squares end up being broken by King's German Legion Dragoons because they initially go to scare off some cavalry and then get surprised by the fact that there are some French infantry nearby and charge them. Absolute suicide most of the time, but by freak chance, one of the dragoons' horses falls across the face of the square and creates an opening, and the square gets gutted, and then this creates this kind of ripple effect. So every division in the French army gets mauled. That therefore means they have to pull away to the northeast, and that opens the way for Madrid to be taken. There's a small force directly under the command of Joseph, 15,000 men. There's no way they were ever going to stand against the might of Wellington's army. And it's a catastrophic propaganda fail for the French. This is the Spanish capital that's been occupied, the seat of French control in Spain, and Napoleon's imposed brother, the monarch, has been sent fleeing. And this caricature in the top right of your picture beautifully demonstrates that. So you may be able to make out some faint figures in the top left corner of the caricature. That is King Joseph being chased out of Madrid by a bunch of women waving brooms. So huge opportunities for ridicule for Napoleon's choice of Spanish monarch. And with that, however, comes challenges. What you have in the center of your picture is a sketch of Wellington drawn by Francisco de Goya whilst Wellington was in Madrid, and you can see the toll that the war has taken on him. Those eyes are like pits of despair. You can see how gaunt Wellington is, and that perhaps gives us an inkling into why things go quite badly wrong. He then goes and lays siege to the castle of Burgos in the north of the country, and it's frankly a pig's ear of an operation. It goes horribly wrong. And by the end of the year, the other French forces, and this is the real significance of Salamanca, have decided that enough is enough. They have seen Wellington now occupy the heart of French control in Spain. Something has got to be done about this. And all of that squabbling suddenly becomes far less significant in the face of this threat. So what you have is Soult abandoning Andalusia, literally abandoning it, packing up his army, 24,000 men, and marching north to try and hit Wellington in the rear. Clausel is able to rally the army of Portugal with staggering speed and push back on the offensive. He gets reinforcements from Cavalry in the far north of the country. And what you have is this sort of this snare closing in on Wellington, and he has no choice but to cut and run. He tries to offer battle again at Salamanca, occupying much the same ground as he had on the 22nd of July, but to no avail. This time there is no offence. There's no mistake, but it is very telling that the French are not willing to attack him when he offers battle, despite outnumbering him substantially. What has happened by this point is that Wellington has gained a psychological ascendancy over the French, that they are running scared when they have odds of something like 3-2. Some sources estimate that it's something like 2-1. Huge numbers that we're talking about here, and yet the French will not attack him. Wellington has established that superiority in mindset over the French, that they know he is dangerous. What do they do to plan for the following year? They dig in. The only thing they can think to do is to create a series of fortifications that will bar Wellington's advance into the centre of the country. The French, despite controlling Spain, are now on the defensive and know they're on the defensive. And that lays the foundations for the eventual collapse of French control in Spain. Folks, that is going to be it for tonight. Please do keep the questions coming in if you would like to. Noah coming in saying, are you surprised that Marmont wasn't given the post-failure treatment of Messina by Napoleon? I'd assume friendship and the need for corps commanders was too understandably great for Napoleon to be able to sideline him. One thing to bear in mind about Messina, so what Noah's referring to here is that in 1811, Messina, having not succeeded with his invasion of Portugal in 1810-11, and then fighting at Fiente d'Onoro, but within days actually being replaced as commander by Marmont, is packed off and into retirement. The thing about Messina, though, was that he had to be brought out of retirement for the Portugal campaign, for that third invasion of Portugal. So actually to send Messina back into retirement probably isn't such a big deal. There's also the point that Messina is very old and very tired at this point. He doesn't really want to keep fighting. I don't personally feel that Messina wanted to fight the 1810-11 campaign. I genuinely don't. He goes about it in a very methodical, competent way, but just doesn't manage to pull it off. So I think you do hit the nail on the head there, Noah. There's a need for people who are competent. Important emphasis there. Marmont was competent. Sure, he doesn't fight a great 1813-14 campaign. and that taints his career, no question. I think the need for people is strong. Loyalty also significant at this point. Who can Napoleon trust? Well, Marmont's been his protege. He's served him loyally all the way through. Obviously, Napoleon doesn't know that Marmont's going to turn around when the writing is very clearly on the wall and the war is definitely over and go, I've had enough. I'm not fighting on anymore. I'm going to surrender my army. So I think all of that comes together to lead to what happens to Marmont when it comes to 1813, and the fact that he's not sort of given the hairdryer treatment. Napoleon also feels slightly unfazed when he hears about the news of Salamanca. So he gets the news on Salamanca literally the night before Borodino. And he just says, doesn't matter, because tomorrow I'll decide the fate of Europe. Now, of course, we know that that's not what transpires, but nonetheless, it gives you an indication that actually this is Napoleon's Spanish ulcer. Salamanca is the point at which that Spanish ulcer really starts to bleed, but it's an ulcer, it's a drain. And I'll give you an indication of how much the Russia campaign is far more important than the Peninsular War. Because what does Napoleon do in 1813 when he's trying to rebuild his force? He takes forces out of Spain to start to rebuild that force that he will use in Central Europe for what goes on to become the Leipzig campaign. Spain is, much though British historians love to jump up and down and emphasize its importance, and it's not unimportant, Spain is nonetheless a subsidiary of the Napoleonic Wars. Folks, that is going to be it for today, unless there are any more questions coming in. Glad you've enjoyed the show. Please do remember to like to help with that algorithmic spread, and also subscribe if you're new here so you can find your way back and attend more of these. There will be others incoming. I'm going to sit down and discuss Napoleon's mental state with a leading expert on that topic, Ed Koss, in a little while. I believe that's penciled in for the 12th of August. I'll also be sitting down with other leading experts of the period, and if you enjoyed these, you can, of course, make your appreciation known so that I'll know to do more of them in due course. As ever, these things don't happen by magic. If you are able to support the show, details at the bottom of your screen. If you prefer a one-off form of support for your entertainment this evening over the last hour and a half, go to Ko-fi, K-O, the details are on the bottom of your screen, folks, in terms of the precise web address, ko-fi.com/Napoleonicist, where you can leave one-off tips. That all gets poured into the Let's Go to More Battlefields and create more content fund. Like I say, the next step actually for the Salamanca one is to go back out there and do it by drone, and also gain more footage from different perspectives and do more of that shoot to camera stuff that you saw earlier in the live stream. The idea being that there'll be a series of kind of breakdowns of different sections of the battle for all of these battles. But obviously it's a hugely expensive endeavor. So if you're able to support with a one-off tip, that would be amazing. Equally, if you prefer to get something back in return, which I completely understand, and you're in a financial position where you might be able to make an ongoing contribution, head over to patreon.com/Napoleonic Wars pod, where you'll be able to sign up and get a whole raft of perks. Tiers start at £1 a month, going up through the ranks from £3, £7, 14, 25 and 40, and the perks increase with each tier. So if you fancy taking part in an online course all about this period, and we change the focus each time, then hey, you're going to want to head over to Patreon and find out more about that. If you fancy attending socials with like-minded fans of the period, again, you can find details on Patreon. It's been an absolute joy to see you all for this, folks. We do have a couple more comments coming in. Geraint wants one on the Pyrenees campaign. Geraint, I've got to go to the Pyrenees, which means I've got to find flight money and car hire money and accommodation money. So would love to, but until I've been there, I can't do one on the Pyrenees because I haven't got anything to show you. Folks, it's been an absolute joy. Please remember to like and subscribe. I've been your host, Dr. Zack White. This has been the Napoleonic Wars channel. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and thank you for watching.